In June 1921, a film was released that is now lost. That could be the end of the story because there were plenty of other films with a similar summary. But this film, titled Heedless Moths, was a little bit different. It told the story of model Audrey Munson's life. You probably don't know her, but she was considered the Venus de Milo of her time, posing as a nude model countless times for artists who featured her figure on statues, sculptures, and architectural details across the world. Yet, despite her rare international fame in the Gilded Age, her name doesn't really register with most people. This is the story of Audrey Munson and her very, very long fall from the top. Model Audrey Munson became an international beauty sensation after she had posed for perhaps as many as 36 works of art to be shown at the Panama Pacific International Exhibition in 1915, and she became associated with that specific event. A few years later, in 1919, she had been involved in a scandal where she had been linked to an affair with a married doctor who had murdered his wife. Because Munson had stayed at his boarding house, she was suspected of being his mistress, but there was no real proof of this. But her reputation was somewhat tarnished by the incident. Earlier that same year, she had written to the State Department, showing a paranoia of a conspiracy against her by the German government and some German Americans, and also expressed disdain for Jewish people. This bizarre incident didn't get any public attention, but it foreshadows what would happen later. But anyway, by the turn of the decade, she was seeking to restart her career and be in the spotlight once again. This resulted in the production of a film called Heedless Moths, which was set for release in early June 1921, and got a lot of coverage thanks to William Randolph Hearst's newspaper Empire, which ran double-page articles supposedly written by Munson herself in every Sunday magazine for 6 months straight in support of the movie. Though, as it turned out, these were all ghost-written. The film was purchased by Equity Pictures for distribution, and caused a bit of a stir. The movie would feature Munson posing nude in multiple scenes. While another actress, Jane Thomas, played Munson for all the acting parts, Munson herself performed the nude scenes. This wasn't actually the first time she had done this, however. She had appeared nude in 3 independent films before, each time stirring up some controversy. A censorship board had been established in Hollywood back in 1909, and her previous films had slipped by, claiming that the nudity was for artistic purposes, though some scenes were recommended to be edited to reduce the screen time for the nudity. But because of the controversial nature of the films, they were almost guaranteed to not be too successful. And by all accounts, they weren't especially good either. But some people were refreshed by the novelty of having something so artistic finally put on the screen. Of Heedless Moths, Munson said, "I bared my body and gave to the world a masterpiece. In giving Heedless Moths to the screen, I have bared my heart and soul." But not many agree that it was a masterpiece. It received pretty negative reviews for a lack of an engaging story. But to be fair, it was an independent film in the midst of the emerging big studios that were starting to dominate the industry and steal away most of the top-level talent. The film premiered at the Greenwich Village Theatre on June 3, 1921. Surprisingly, the movie, despite its most obvious appeal, also used some other gimmicks to help it become more popular. This included utilizing small screens off-center of the stage, the film screen being cut out to reveal the actual cast in person behind it, and concluding with an appearance of Munson herself at the end of the film. These gimmicks received mixed reviews from critics, one writing in the New York Times that, "The most interesting thing about the performance, in fact, is watching for the next stunt of presentation." Another critic in the Film Daily wrote, "The continuity of the film is only fair, but might seem better if the picture were run straight away, and not broken for stage effects, as it is in its New York presentation." The film, while sparking a lot of attention in the press for its controversial nature, was ultimately a flop, and Munson's career had already been on the wane. She would soon be 30, deemed too old for a model prized for her natural beauty. Around the same time, another new film starring her was making the rounds, though this turned out to just be a repackaged and re-edited version of a previous film from 5 years ago. In the September 1921 issue of Photoplay magazine, perhaps the most popular film fan magazine of the time, published an editorial that read as follows. "Heedless Moths, despite whatever claim it may make as a story or dramatic photoplay, is nothing but a bold bid to indecency. Produced by Perry Photoplays, it is the characteristic exhibition of certain new producers who bring nothing into the field but an insincere vehicle to make a little tainted money. Its star is Audrey Munson, who may or may not be remembered in an undraped celluloid demonstration satirically called Purity. Heedless Moths had to have a story, and this one is laid in Greenwich Village, that overrated and so-called artistic quarter of New York City. It is not an interesting story, it is a tiresome play. And let us hasten to add, in order that no craven pulse may quicken with anticipation, it does not even purvey the prurient thrill which is its thinly veiled pretense. No one knew better than its producers that downright uncleanliness could not be shown at all. So that all we have left is mock sentimentality, lachrymose titling, a considerable extent of unnecessary and unstimulating epidermis, and boredom. Don't patronize it, for it is not worth your attention from any angle. If you do patronize it, you are adding fuel to the intolerant flame of censorship. As scathing as that review was, there was some truth, as well as some assumed truth, to it. Without the novelty of nudity, no one probably would have cared about Heedless Moths. Audrey Munson might have been famous years before, but her career was on the decline, and her life story wasn't very relevant anymore. And that comment about censorship at the end proved very telling. Shortly afterward, a big event happened in Hollywood. The Fatty Arbuckle murder scandal, which caused Hollywood to try and clean up its image more than before, especially since this was just one of quite a few scandals from the previous couple of years. This would be the final nail in the coffin for Heedless Moths. Then, things just got worse for Munson. Here's a newspaper clipping which briefly talks about what happened next. Audrey Munson arrested for posing in the nude. St. Louis, October 4th, 1921. Trial of Audrey Munson, famous artist model, held on a charge of conspiracy to injure public morals, was continued until today. Miss Munson was arrested Saturday when police closed the show. They charged Miss Munson was posing practically nude. Miss Munson came to St. Louis in connection with the picture Innocence, in which she takes the leading part. That film Innocence, by the way, was that new film that was just a rehash of an older one that I mentioned earlier. Munson had been doing this sort of show for years. During the run of her previous films, 5 and 6 years previously, she had made appearances where she would briefly pose nude or almost nude. But these were not generally received as lewd, but rather as an artistic expression. Now, suddenly, she was arrested for doing it. And as you heard in that newspaper clipping, it had been described as practically nude. With the standards of the time being far more conservative in regards to nudity, it's hard to tell exactly what that meant. By this point, she was in a very dark place. Her film had flopped, she had been very publicly arrested, and would soon be seen as too old to be beautiful. The next year, she attempted suicide, but failed. She practically disappeared for the next 9 years, but it seems that things were not going well for her, because in 1931, she was placed in St. Lawrence Hospital for the Insane in Ogdenburg, New York, by her mother, who said her daughter was experiencing prolonged depression, delusions, and hallucinations. But get this, she would stay in that asylum for the next 65 years, dying in 1996 at the age of 104. Her mother had died in 1958, and had been her only visitor. For the next 26 years, she would have no visitors from the outside. In 1984, she was miraculously discovered by a half-niece who wanted to reunite her father with his long-lost sister. I find that fascinating. Think about it. You figure out that you were related to a woman who is considered one of the most beautiful in the world, featured in sculptures and art all around the world at a time when international fame was extremely rare. You might expect her to be long dead, but you find her pent up in an asylum she had spent more than half of her life in. I couldn't find much about her condition when she was rediscovered, but 26 years of virtual solitude must have diminished her ability to interact with others, I would imagine. And she had apparently been delusional and had been having hallucinations when she was first sent to the asylum, so I wonder how lucid she was by that time. However, her niece has gone down on record as saying that she thought her aunt's mind was perfectly fine when she rediscovered her. Ironically, this rather tragic ending seems like it could be made into a successful and poignant movie along the lines of Sunset Boulevard, but maybe it's just better to let things be. Well, that's all for this video. There was quite a bit of crossover with other decades in this one since Audrey Munson was a star in decline by the 1920s, but I thought this story was pretty interesting, so I thought I'd cover it. There's not a whole lot written about Audrey Munson since her image really transcended herself as a person, so I didn't really have a lot to work with, but I hope you enjoyed the video anyway. I was able to find a piece in Movie Weekly that was supposedly written using information from an interview with Audrey herself, which covers up to around 1920. It says that the story will be continued in the next issue, but I cannot seem to find that issue anywhere online. So if anyone can track down the July 8th, 1922 issue of Movie Weekly, please let me know so I can give the full story. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.